Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if it's your first time here. My name is Miriam, and today I wanted to wrap up all the books that I read in April. April was a really interesting month just because I had exams in the middle of the month, and so I hadn't read a lot at the beginning, but then after exams I just read, so I have a lot of books that I read in the second half. The books that I read before exams, I almost forget everything about them just because I read them and then I went into study mode and it's like everything else was just wiped from my brain. And so I'll do my best to talk about the books I read before exams. Before I get started, I just want to ask each of you guys a favor. So sometime in the next couple weeks, I want to do a video, which is going to be like a this or that video. And I got the idea from Lovely Day with Holly. And she mentioned getting the idea from JD Ray Reads. And so I'm kind of pulling different this or that bookish questions from different sources, so from their videos. And I would also like some ideas from you guys as well. So if you have any ideas for a bookish this or that, just put them in the comments below. And yeah, I'm really excited for filming that video. It's gonna be really fun. So moving on to my April wrap up. So I read 14 books in April, which I'm very happy with, and I DNF'd 2 of them. So I'm going to start off with the 2 DNFs and then work my way from my least favorite book up until my favorite book of the month, which is what I like to do in my wrap-ups. So I'm going to start off with the DNFs. So I first DNF'd 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This was a book that has been on my TBR for a very long time. And so I tried to read it. I got to about a quarter of the book and I was just completely bored and had no interest in continuing on with the story. The edition that I have actually came slightly abridged. I think the completely unabridged editions have passages that are very focused on like the science within the book or whatever, like the submarines and all that. But the edition I had was slightly abridged. And so even with that one, I just wasn't enjoying the story at all. So I decided to set it aside. And I'm completely okay with that. And the second book that I DNF'd is Greenwood by Michael Christie, I think is his name. I was really interested in the concept of this book, which is basically about a family, and it's kind of like a family saga. And at the center of this family is trees, basically, or logging. And so we have the first perspective that takes place in, I think, the 2030s. So it's set in the future. And it's during a time where the earth has lost a lot of its old growth trees, and it's like illegal to cut down trees. Physical books made out of paper are considered like vintage. And I don't remember much else about this book because I was trying to read it right before I started studying for exams, and so my memory kind of sucks. But so we have this perspective in the 2030s, and then the book goes back in time. So we go to 2008, and then the 1970s, and then the 1930s. And so it's each like a different generation of this Greenwood family. And I just kind of lost interest once I started reading the second perspective, which is set in 2008. It's a literary fiction type of family saga, and I really struggle to get into literary fiction a lot of the time. I think I'm just very particular with the writing styles that I enjoy, but if you do enjoy family sagas and if you enjoy like nature writing, this might be a hit for you. So I would still recommend it. It just wasn't a story that I felt the need to continue reading, but the concept was really interesting. And yeah, so those are the 2 books that I DNF'd. And now I'll start with my least favorite book of the month and work my way up. So my least favorite book of the month was one of the weirdest books I have ever read. And a lot of people describe this book as really weird. And that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. What this book is about. So we have a man named Piranesi, and he's in this house, which is basically like a labyrinth, and it's this massive house. It knows no end. It's basically the world in this book is this house. And there are so many different levels and tunnels and passages and statues. Like, I was just struggling to wrap my mind around the descriptions of what this house is supposed to look like. Some of the floors have storms, the rooms flood, there's like an ocean in one of the halls, and it's just very odd. And so the man Piranesi in this book, he's just kind of learning about this house, he's exploring it, and there's another person in the house called the Other, and it's just a very interesting dynamic between the two. Piranesi and the Other visit with each other and talk about this thing called the Great and Secret Knowledge. And then there is evidence that there's another person in this house, and the direction this book takes is just really interesting. I don't know how I feel about it. I still don't know how I feel about the ending of this book, just the whole process of getting through it. It was just so weird. It was so weird. Honestly, I think I feel really dumb. Like, I feel too dumb to understand like the underlying themes behind this book. they just go over my head. The writing was definitely beautiful, and there are instances where I'm like appreciative of what I just read, but I found myself frustrated just because I felt like as a reader I was aimlessly wandering. I personally was not a fan of this feeling, and as short as this book is, it felt extremely long to me. It's a very long, short book, just the way that it was written. And by the time I got to the end, I was left with more questions, and sometimes that is something I'm okay with. Sometimes that really bothers me, and in this case, I just wasn't too thrilled. So I ended up giving this 3 stars just because I don't feel that it's fair to rate it any lower, because I understand that this book, you know, has merit, and this author is definitely talented, and people who are smarter than me can, you know, understand more of what the author was trying to get across in this book and appreciate it, but it's just not for readers like me, I guess. And yeah, I did try it. I'm happy I read it, but I would never ever read this again. So yeah, that was the very interesting Piranesi. Next up, we have The Moving Finger by Agatha Christie, and this is the 4th Miss Marple book in the series, if I'm not mistaken. And this book, if you don't want to know what the plot is about, because I know a lot of Agatha Christie readers like to go in blind and just skip ahead a little bit, but I'm just going to talk just a little bit about the plot. So we have a sibling pair. We have Joanna and Jerry, and they move to this town, and they get to know the people that are living there, and the residents of the town start to get letters, and they're letters that are kind of accusing them of very scandalous things. And so we have Jerry and Joanna. They're just kind of the main characters, but they're kind of like observing everything going on in this town. And then we have a death that occurs, and the woman that died is one of the women that received a very scandalous letter. She dies, and it's believed to be suicide, but in typical Agatha Christie fashion, there's a lot more to this death than meets the eye. So Jerry and Joanna kind of start looking into things, and then eventually Miss Marple comes in. And my main gripe with this book is that Miss Marple's page time was very small. We didn't get to see her very much in this book, and that was a little bit of a letdown. Personally, I really like when she's extremely involved in the mystery and involved with the characters, and, you know, we get more dialogue with Miss Marple. That's definitely what I prefer. I did really enjoy Joanna and Jerry. They were very entertaining siblings, but all the other characters in the story really fell flat for me, and overall, this was a pretty average Agatha Christie for me, nothing too special. So I ended up giving it 3 stars, but I am really glad I read it, and I look forward to reading more Miss Marple books. So the last 3-star book that I read, even though I gave it 3 stars, I really enjoyed my time reading it, and that is The Captain's Daughter by Jennifer Delamere. So this book is basically about a woman named Rosalind, and her sisters are orphans. They grew up in a very good orphanage, considering how bad a lot of the orphanages were during the Victorian era. And she ends up being a little too old to continue living there, so she gets a job as a lady's companion. But something happens when she is in this house, in this lady's house, and so she has to basically go on the run. So Rosalind ends up in London, and here in London she meets some people that work for a theater, and she ends up able to work as a kind of seamstress for the actresses in the theater. And then we have a man named Nate who is working at this theater in place of his brother, who had an injury, and so Nate is just kind of preventing his brother from losing this position by doing his job for him, and kind of ensuring that his brother has a job to go back to once he's recovered. And so, of course, in typical historical Christian fiction fashion, Rosalind and Nate end up meeting at the theater, and there are some very predictable outcomes for them. And so, besides the fact that I could predict almost every single major plot point in this book, I had so much fun. I think the author did a very good job of creating very real characters. I truly felt like these characters were well developed and just super, super interesting and unique. Each of them had a very unique personality. And I really liked the faith element in this book. I think it was done well. It wasn't too preachy, but it was realistic at the same time. Family dynamics in this book are great. I love how Rosalind interacted with her sisters and Nate with his own family. The camaraderie is great and it's just a whole lot of fun. But I could not give it more than the 3 stars just because of how cliche and tropey this book was, and like I said, very predictable. And there were moments where the main character Rosalind was just way too naive, and there were just massive red herrings that everyone would know, everyone would see, but she was just too naive to realize. But overall, I enjoyed this book and I'm looking forward to reading the next 2 books, which are about Rosalind's 2 sisters. Next up, we have a book that I gave 3.5 stars to, and that is The Mummy Case by Elizabeth Peters. And this is the 3rd Amelia Peabody book, so I am making my way through the series and having a lot of fun. So in the first 2 books, we met Amelia and she ended up getting married and having a child. And in this book, she actually ends up bringing her son, Ramesses, with her and her husband Emerson to Egypt. I think my absolute favorite aspect of this book was their son. He is adorable. He's like this 5-year-old genius child and he's just so cute to follow, and he seems to be really enjoying all the archaeological things that his parents do, and it's just really sweet to see and to read about. So the characters make the series for me much more than the mystery. And the reason I gave it a 3.5 stars is because I wasn't the biggest fan of the mystery itself, but the series is still so addictive and super enjoyable. So in this book, Amelia and Emerson are in Egypt with their son, and Amelia and Emerson are really struggling in their excavations. They're not really finding anything of interest until a murder occurs in Cairo, and an antiques shop dealer is murdered, and there's some evidence that he was dealing in the black market. And so Amelia, being Amelia, she gets involved in trying to figure out what happened to him. And that's where the mystery picks up. And I don't think I should say anything else. Just a whole lot of fun, a great cozy mystery series. Even if you're not the biggest cozy mystery fan, if you love really funny characters, I highly recommend this series. And yeah, that is book 3. I can't wait to read more in this series. So another book that I gave 3.5 stars to, I'm actually really sad because I was expecting this book to be a 5-star read, and it wasn't. It was just 3.5 stars. That doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it, but overall, I didn't love it, and I was expecting to, so unfortunately, that would be Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I love Wuthering Heights, and I think that just made my expectations so much higher for Jane Eyre. And I have to say, the character of Jane is a very fascinating character to follow, and I really love that this book was in the first-person narration because I feel like I really got to know Jane as a person, as a character. So if you don't know what this book is about, we have the character Jane Eyre, who she is living as a young child with her aunt and her cousins, and they are awful human beings. She ends up moving to this school, spends her childhood there. It's not the best of places. And then when she's about 18, she ends up working as a governess in this house where we have Mr. Rochester and his young ward. And so Jane is like the governess for this little girl, and we get to meet Mr. Rochester. And those of you guys who have read the book know exactly what transpires between Jane and Mr. Rochester. And honestly, I was just really weirded out by their dynamic, the age difference, just their relationship in general. I did not like Mr. Rochester at all. And normally I can read a book and hate the characters and still end up loving the book. But in this case, I just couldn't stand Mr. Rochester. I couldn't stand like every word that came out of his mouth. I don't know, it just annoyed me so much. Like, he was just weird. He was just so weird. And like I said, Jane was a great character, and I really like the writing style. It's a very easy classic to read, but I just wasn't wowed by this book. I went into it thinking it would be a lot more gothic than it really ended up being. So yeah, it was like a mix of enjoyable moments and disappointments, and I can't give it a 4 stars. I don't know. I feel a lot more comfortable with a 3.5 star rating, but this is still a book that I would reread in the future, and part of me thinks that my lack of enjoyment maybe has to do with the fact that I was really stressed with school around the time that I was reading it, and maybe I just need to like reread it to kind of gain a new perspective. But I am still so confused as to what I feel towards this book. I have so many mixed emotions, mixed thoughts, but that is Jane Eyre. Next up, we have The Diamond Eye by Kate Quinn, and this is my first Kate Quinn book. It is a historical fiction set around World War II, and I ended up giving this 3.75 stars. I overall really enjoyed it, and I think that it is a great World War II historical fiction from a very interesting perspective. So in this book, we have a woman named Mila, and she became a sniper during World War II, and this is based on a true story, so it was really interesting to look her up and kind of gain more perspective on who she was as a person and then her role in the war. But yeah, Mila is a Russian sniper, and she is basically just killing Nazis. That's her job, that's her role in the army. And at the beginning of the book, we get a little bit of her backstory. We get to meet her husband, who she's really not a fan of. She's trying to divorce him, but he's making that very difficult. We meet her little boy, who she ends up leaving with his grandparents during the war. And we really get to see her as a mom trying to basically compartmentalize these different aspects of who she is as she is fighting. And I just found it very interesting to look at Mila as a character and kind of see how she had to basically just forget that her family exists, that her son exists, otherwise she wouldn't be able to be this amazing sniper that she is in this book. So yeah, following her in this book was incredible. She went through so much, so many war injuries. And then an interesting aspect in this book is that throughout the story, we kind of go forward in time, and then we go back to Mila during her time in the army. But each little section that we step forward a few months is Mila basically in America on a tour with a Russian delegation. And so she befriends Eleanor Roosevelt, and it's a really interesting perspective to be had. There is a man that is planning on assassinating the president, and I did enjoy those sections. But personally for me, I think the whole thing with this guy trying to, plan how to assassinate Franklin Roosevelt, it just kind of took me out of Mila's story, and I just wasn't as interested in that aspect. I don't know, just in general, there were moments where I was really taken out of the story, and I had a lot of ups and downs with how I was feeling about this book. In some chapters, I found myself a little bit bored, and a lot of the descriptions of what was going on with the army and all the different ranks and all of that was just going over my head. And then there were moments that I really enjoyed, and I thought they were very tension-filled and well-written. And overall, again, I gave this 3.75 stars. I think it was a great historical fiction, and I 100% want to read more of Kate Quinn. It's a very interesting take on World War II, and I would recommend. So now I'm going to go over all the books that I gave 4 stars to, and I have quite a bit. 4 stars seems to be the rating I gave out most this month, which I'm very happy about. So we have The Man Who Died Twice by Richard Osman, and this is book 2 in the Thursday Murder Club series, which I am very much enjoying, and I'm super excited for book 3, which, if I'm not mistaken, is coming out later this year or early next year. So in this book, we get to learn a little bit more about Elizabeth, who in the first book we met, and she is part of this group of 4 septuagenarians in a retirement village. And in the first book, this group kind of helped solve a murder. And so in this book, we learn a little bit more about Elizabeth and her past. And so at the beginning of the book, Elizabeth gets a letter from a person from her past who is asking her to help him because he has been accused of stealing diamonds worth millions of dollars. And then a dead body shows up, and the mystery ensues from there. And I don't think I should say anything else because this book just has a lot. There's just so many layers to this book, and I don't want to say any more because I'm just peeling back more layers if I give any more details about the mystery itself. But needless to say, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoy these characters, and Richard Osman's writing style is just so gripping and fun and full of heart, and the mystery was great. There was a really good twist at the end, and yeah, I highly recommend checking out the first book if you haven't already. And yeah, I think I enjoyed this one slightly more than the first one. So that is The Man Who Died Twice. Next is The Last Garden in England by Julia Kelly, and this book was so beautiful, and I absolutely loved that it was a triple timeline. So we start off in the present day with a woman named Emma, and she basically has her own gardening and garden restoration business. And so she starts this job at Highbury House, which is a very large historic property, and there is a garden that is locked, and she's just I guess, starting to learn a little bit about the people who used to live in this house. And then we go back in time to World War II and then to the Edwardian period. So in the World War II era, we have a woman named Diana who is living at Highbury House, and she is a war widow, and we learn a little bit more about this garden that she keeps locked. And then we go back to the Edwardian period and we have the Melcourt family who lives in Highbury House, and the original garden designer, we have her perspective. Her name is Venetia. And so we really get to know these women who are at the forefront of this story. We have multiple perspectives. We even have multiple perspectives in the World War II timeline. And this book was just so beautiful. It wasn't a super fast moving plot. It was a lot slower and just heartfelt. It was very, very heartfelt. It's a very captivating story. There are many layers to each character, and then I loved seeing Emma, the present day character, learning about both Diana, who lived at Highbury in the 40s, and then Venetia and her original designs for these gardens, her intent behind them. There's like a mystery involved, and it's such a beautiful story. And I really enjoyed all the allusions to plants and flowers, and I would constantly be Googling all these different flowers that were being named, and it was just, oh, it was so beautiful. I really, really enjoyed this book. Beautiful story, and yeah, highly recommend. Another book I gave 4 stars to is Rainbow Valley by Ella Montgomery. This is book 7 in the Anne series, and it was super, super sweet. In this book, we have all of Anne's children who are growing up. They're enjoying nature. They're just making the best out of life. And they befriend a widower's children. So this is the Meredith family, and there are 4 kids in that family. And then they also befriend a runaway named Mary. And so we have these 11 kids that are just playing outside all the time, having fun, and it's very much just their story, their childhood. It's a very sweet story. I just was a little sad that Anne didn't really have the spotlight anymore, but her children are adorable, and I really, really enjoyed following their shenanigans and all the little things they get up to. I was really interested in the Meredith kids, specifically their father. Like I said earlier, he's a widower in this story, and he's also a preacher. And all he really does all day is sit in his study and prepare sermons and read books, and he doesn't really pay attention to his children. And I think a lot of that had to do with his grief over losing his wife. And so I really loved his development as a father, and seeing him realize just how important it is to be a present father, you know, in his kids' lives. And I think Ella Montgomery did a really good job of portraying his realization. It was very realistic, and yeah, beautifully written. Really, really enjoyed this one. Another 4-star read was A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And this, if you don't know, is about a little girl named Sarah Crewe who ends up moving into a boarding school in London. So she had previously lived in India with her father, but he is going to be away for work basically, and he can't keep her with him. And so she ends up moving into this boarding school, and she's very much pampered. And although she is spoiled, she is a very sweet child and just does her best to get along with the girls that she is living with in this boarding school. But tragedy strikes and her life is just completely upended. Sarah goes from heiress to basically nothing more than a scullery maid, and it is really, really sad. But what I really enjoyed about this book is Sarah showing her maturity and just trying to make the best out of her circumstances. And I really love her imagination in this book, and yeah, it's a really sweet book. I wouldn't say it's a new favorite by any means, but I did really enjoy my time reading it, and I really, really liked the ending. So that is A Little Princess. My last 4-star book is I Must Betray You by Ruta Sepetys, and this is a book that I have been anticipating since I knew it was coming out. I was super excited to read it just because it is about Romania during the Communist Revolution, and I myself am Romanian. So this book is about the Communist Revolution, like I said, and this took place in 1989. And basically we have a teenager named Christian, and he is living in the capital city of Romania, and he is very angry at the government for good reason. During the 80s, Romania just got worse and worse with food rations and rules, and just basically the government taking away the people's freedom. And the leader at the time, Nicolae Ceausescu, he was a tyrant. He was an awful human being. His control over the Romanian people was just absolutely disgusting. And yeah, so this book is about Christian, and he's so angry about what's going on in his country. And he ends up befriending an American family, and he's tasked with spying on them. And through a chain of events, he ends up joining this revolution. And man, this book was really, really fast-paced. Ruta Sepetty's research was immaculate as usual. And it's just crazy to me that my dad was living in Romania. He was 15 years old during this time, and I was able to talk to him a little bit about his experiences, although he did live pretty far away from the capital, but he was living all of this, and just the suffering and the starving. So many people were starving in Bucharest, the capital especially. There was just surveillance everywhere, secret police. It's a very dangerous place to live, and to have any anti-communist political views, it was just extremely dangerous. So this little quote here basically sums up the whole story. Trust no one, tell no one, spies are everywhere. And so yeah, it was just a very high stakes story, and wow. I read this entire book in one sitting because I could not stop. It was so, so good. I just didn't really get that connection with the characters. And I feel like because the book was such a fast moving story, and because I read it so quickly, I almost like, I was kind of like, wait, but I want to know more about Christian as a person. I want to know more about his family. I was just lacking that connection that I had in The Fountains of Silence by this author. But overall, I highly, highly recommend. This time period is not written about very frequently. Very interesting take on the Romanian Communist Revolution in the 80s. And yeah, highly, highly recommend. Okay, moving on to my 3 5-star reads of April. First off, we have The Princess Bride by William Goldman. This was awesome. This was so fun. I'm so, so glad I finally got to it. It has been on my TBR for a very long time. It was just the perfect fairy tale, like the perfect fun and just silly and enjoyable adventure. I feel like if I try to explain the plot, I'm just gonna fumble and mess up. So let me read the back and then I'll kind of go into my thoughts. So it says, as Florin and Gilder teeter on the verge of war, the reluctant Princess Buttercup is devastated by the loss of her true love, kidnapped by a mercenary and his henchmen, rescued by a pirate, forced to marry Prince Humperdinck, and rescued once again by the very crew who absconded with her in the first place. In the course of this dazzling adventure, she'll meet Vizzini, the criminal philosopher who'll do anything for a bag of gold, Fezzik was my favorite, the gentle giant, Inigo, the Spaniard whose steel thirsts for revenge, and Count Rugen, the evil mastermind behind it all. Foiling all their plans and jumping into their stories is Wesley, Princess Buttercup's one true love and a very good friend of a very dangerous pirate. It was just so fun. So Buttercup was a really interesting character. She starts off as a very immature and grumpy teenager, and I really loved seeing her fall in love with Wesley, and oh, it's just so much fun. Fezzik is my absolute favorite. Like it says on the back, he is a gentle giant. He is so funny. This is just your typical fairy tale of good versus evil and damsel in distress, and oh, just so much fun. Oh my goodness. Oh, this is so good. And what I really loved is that throughout the story, we have parts where the author, William Goldman, interrupts and like adds his own little thing. So it'll be like, you know, the plot of the story, and then he'll just kind of come in and he'll be like, oh, it's me again. In this version, this, and this. And I love how he made it seem like he's kind of like doing a commentary on the original text, which was written by the fictional S. Morgenstern. And so it's just a very interesting structure to this book, and the ending was really interesting. You kind of don't know what's going on for a bit, and then he'll come in and explain things, the author will. And yeah, just so much fun. There were some slightly more mature parts in this book, not inappropriate, but just mature. And I honestly thought it would be a middle grade, but it's definitely YA. But yeah, loved it. 5 stars, super enjoyable. The vibes were like a perfect mix of The Hobbit and The Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. I don't know, totally felt those two stories kind of like similar vibes in this book. A big thank you to Katie from Paperbacks and Ponytails, because I would not have prioritized this book if I didn't know she loved it so much. So I'm really, really glad I read it. And yeah, that is The Princess Bride. My second favorite book of the month was Rilla of Ingleside, which is book 8 in the Anne series, and I have officially finished all the books in the Anne of Green Gables series. It's really bittersweet. But yeah, this book, oh my gosh, it was amazing. So we have Rilla, who is Anne and Gilbert's youngest daughter, and she's a teenager, and she's going through the typical phase of just, you know, wanting to have a beau, and she's your typical teenager. This is when World War I starts, and two of Anne and Gilbert's sons go off to war, and I don't want to say anything else because I think that's all you should know going into this book. Oh, also Rilla has a beau and he goes off to war, and so you're really rooting for these boys that are fighting, and we're getting letters from them, and then we just have all the goings on in Glen St. Mary, which is where the Blythes live, and all the different clubs and things that are happening to help the war effort. And it's just a very, very sad yet still funny and charming book, but it definitely has a different tone than the other Anne books. But yeah, it was amazing, and I cried. There were some parts that made me cry. It was very emotional. But yeah, it was sad, but so good. And I loved it. And I can't believe I'm finished the series. Can't believe it. Okay, so my favorite book of April was Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Wow, this was so good. So basically it is about a pandemic that hits the earth and wipes out like 90+% of Earth's population. And we jump back and forth a lot in time, different time periods, different character perspectives. So it can be a little bit confusing, but once I got used to how much it was jumping back and forth, I was really getting invested. And so at the beginning of the book, we meet a man named G. Van, and he's attending a Shakespeare play, and the lead actor ends up having a heart attack and he dies. And then that same night, G. Van is getting phone calls. The pandemic is wreaking havoc. People in Toronto are being hospitalized and dying, and it's just extremely scary. I truly felt G. Van's fear during this time, and so he ends up going and hiding in an apartment with his brother, and slowly electricity goes out. News anchors are leaving the studio. It's so creepy and unsettling. There are food shortages, the internet stops working, and then we jump 20 years into the future. Earth is just a completely different place. There's no electricity, no internet. And so in the future, we have the Traveling Symphony, which is a group that continues to put on Shakespeare plays and concerts and things like that. And we have a character named Kirsten, and she's basically the main character of this book. And so Kirsten was a young girl when the lead actor in the Shakespeare play died, and she was a witness, she was there. So we have all these characters and their perspectives and how they interacted both in the past, how they're interacting in the future, and it's just all wonderfully interconnected. I really loved how the author set this story up, and it was just so good. It was super melancholic and unsettling and very humbling, and it really made me appreciate all the things I take for granted. And yeah, like the way the author explored themes of survival and resilience and fear and art. She did such a good job of exploring so many themes within such a short book. I was just amazed. I definitely had a book hangover by the time I finished this. I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't really pick up another book because I kept thinking about this one. It was amazing. Amazing. And I 100% want to read more of this author. This is my first Emily St. John Mandel book, and I am really looking forward to trying more of her books. So those are all the books I read in April. I am overall really happy with my reading month. I am glad that most of the books I really enjoyed. Please do let me know if you guys have read any of these books and what your thoughts were. Thanks guys so much for watching, and I really appreciate each and every one of you guys for taking the time out of your day to watch my videos. And I really hope to see you all in my next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you guys are so inclined. And again, thank you for watching. Bye!